when we started, there was a tremendous amount of knowledge about the relationship between education at a general level and earnings. That was probably one of the best known levels of understanding in social science. But there wasn't that much knowledge about it at a more detailed level, and that was really what we wanted to look at. We wanted to look at the effect not only of the type of institution, of the type of program, and of the path that students took through college. So it was really to try to get below the surface of a very general level of knowledge that was common at the time. So we had several goals, really several areas. I mean, so the basic idea was to look at different types of degrees and different types of programs and what those earnings were. So that was one set of issues. We also had some other policy questions that we were interested in, some issues about the relationship between financial aid and earnings, between working while enrolled or work-study programs and how that influenced earnings. And then at the same time we had some methodological questions that were of interest to us. If you compare the earnings of people in different programs and say one program they earn more, it's possible that students who entered those programs aren't the same. So that's been an issue with this type of research. So we were concerned about making some methodological advances in terms of being able to draw causal or better causal conclusions from the type of research we were doing. And another issue that was of interest to us was that in many cases the data we had were from one state, and many students who left the state kind of got out of our data sets. So we were concerned about what influence that had, because a lot of research is done on data just from one state. So does it mean that when a student leaves the state, it looks like they're not employed? So we wanted to try to address that methodological issue as well. We certainly found that in general, associate's degrees have good returns. They're a good investment for the individual. They're also a good investment for society as well. Of course, the individual is benefited because they're not paying the full cost of the education that they're getting. The state and sometimes the local government, sometimes the federal government is also investing in that. But even if you take the whole society cost, then in general, on average, associate's degrees have good returns, although one of the things that we found is that there's a lot of variation in that. If you're an associate's degree in a community college, it's like a general studies degree, which is primarily designed to prepare you for transfer. If you don't transfer with those degrees, they're not worth very much. So if you're going to stop at a community college, then an occupational degree is probably a better idea. The general studies degrees are valuable if you're going to transfer. We did a lot of research on certificates. There's a tremendous amount of interest in certificates. All of the ambitious goals that both the administration and many foundations have about college attainment really depend on certificates. They're a very fast-growing post-secondary award. And we found that there was some benefits to them. Longer-term certificates tended to have stronger returns. Certificates that took less than a year, that was very variable, and sometimes there were no returns. In some cases, there were actually negative returns to those. So I think that once again, it depended a lot on which area you were in. The health certificates tended to be very positive. So in many ways, the health certificates really pulled up the average of overall certificates. So we found, I think those were the two sort of big conclusions that we had with respect to the two different types of degrees. We did some work on the earnings of students who went to for-profits, and those tended to be negative. That is, in the sense that the typical students who went to, similar students who went to public institutions tend to earn more than those who went to for-profits. So that's probably consistent with a lot of the other research which is taking place now, or which has come out recently. We found an interesting conclusion that if you had work-study employment, that if you just looked at the average, that was a bit misleading. If you worked on campus, or we were kind of assuming that if you worked in an area that was related to what you were doing, in what you were studying, that those had benefits, whereas if you worked off campus or you were doing something that wasn't related to your area of study, then that actually tended to have negative consequences. So the conclusion there was you can't just look at the average. I think that's consistent with an awful lot of what we're doing, which is to say that you need to break these down into greater, to more detail and more specificity to really understand the relationship between education and employment and earnings. One of the main lessons is that when they're thinking about education, they have to think about programs. That's very important. Even within the same institution, programs have very different outcomes. I think that, of course, we found that health programs are, tend to be strong. But even the variation that takes place among programs within one institution is often greater than the variation between different types of institutions. So I think that's one crucial question. I think another lesson really is that there's a lot to be learned from these data. It's very difficult. We spent a lot of time acquiring the data. There's not a good process to be able to assemble transcript level data, which is very rich and gives us a lot of insights, and link that to employment data. So I would hope that policymakers in the states and at the federal level, understand that and see that there's a lot to be learned from this, and yet it's very difficult to actually carry that out. I hope that people will see that we've made a lot of progress going from more general knowledge of the relationship between general education degrees, such as associate's degree or bachelor's degree, to a much more nuanced understanding of the relationship between a more detailed level of measurement of education and earnings. I still think there's lots of questions to go, so we hope that people will take this conference and sort of use that as a springboard to go to further issues. A big issue really has to do with how students get into different types of programs. I mean, one conclusion often is that low-income and minority students tend to end up in programs that have lower levels of earnings. Why is that? How can we have a system that really focuses on helping students figure out which program they want to go into, that provides information to them about the economic returns to those programs and helps them figure out what's best for them?